Thank you, Jim. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I really want to thank you and the School for International Service for hosting us here. And I want to thank all of you for coming. It's really very impressive. We have hosted these events at night and during the day, and we always have had great crowds. And I think this time, of course, it is the speaker who draws such a wonderful, large crowd. I would like to welcome you all here to what I think is a very special occasion, because we are hosting with Professor Shlomo Ben-Ami, both a very distinguished scholar and historian, and a politician who is deeply involved in the peace efforts of the Middle East. And let me just begin by reading one paragraph, the first paragraph of his book, Scars of Wars, Wounds of Peace. And he starts it with the following dialogue. He says, "Do you think we can still make it? I was asked by President Clinton when on Saturday, December 20th, 2000, I was leaving the cabinet room adjacent to the Oval Office in the White House, where the president had just finished communicating to the Israeli and Palestinian delegations to the peace talks his final parameters for a settlement. 'I don't know, Mr. President,' I replied. 'If we have enough political time left to wrap up an agreement. But what I am sure of is that if we fail, we all have plenty of time to write books about it.'" Here it is. One of the books written was this really very important study about the history of the long Israeli-Arab tragedy, and to the best of my knowledge, the only positive side effect of the failure of peace negotiations. Let me introduce our speaker briefly. Shlomo Ben-Ami was born in Tangier, Morocco, and immigrated to Israel in young years. He received his education both at Tel Aviv University and then later his PhD at Oxford at St. Anthony's College. After completing his PhD in Oxford, he returned to Tel Aviv and was for many years a distinguished professor at the university, at Tel Aviv University in the history department. His special field is Spanish history, and he published a lot of studies, 2 books on modern Spanish history. Shortly after the 2 countries, Spain and Israel, established diplomatic ties, he became, in 1987, the Israeli ambassador to Spain. And that was, I think, the first political office. Others followed suit. He became a member of the Knesset. He was elected a member of the Israeli parliament. He became Minister of Internal Security, and in 2000, he was appointed Israel's foreign minister. His Vita shows a long list of efforts for peace and reconciliation with Israel's Arab neighbors. He was a member of Israel's delegation to the Madrid Peace Conference. In 1993, he headed the Israeli delegation at the multilateral talks on refugees in the Middle East. And as foreign minister, he conducted the secret negotiations with Abu Allah in Stockholm and participated with then Prime Minister Ehud Barak in the Camp David summit, after which he led the Israeli team in all the different phases of the negotiations with the Palestinians, including the Taba negotiations. Despite his involvement in politics, Professor Ben-Ami remained active in academic life. He served as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. He created the Curiel Center for International Studies at Tel Aviv University, which he headed until 1996, and he kept writing books. He published a book in France entitled Quel avenir pour Israël, analyzing the Israeli-Palestinian situation, Israel's regional and international dilemmas. And then his comprehensive and I think really very useful book on the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, the Arab-Israeli tragedy, appeared in 2005. In times of intense diplomatic activities, you might have heard actually that Prime Minister Netanyahu is in Jordan today, and there is something new every day. In times of these intense diplomatic activities in Israel and in the Middle East, it is our privilege to get an insider's perspective from one of Israel's outstanding politicians and scholars, and please join me in welcoming Professor Ben-Ami to American University.
Well, thank you, Professor Brenner, for your very kind introduction. And what I'm going to do in this talk is to a quick march through the complexities of the current conditions in the region, where regional changes are being produced, and what is the impact that can these regional changes have on the Israeli-Arab situation, on the Israeli-Palestinian protracted peace process. And there are protracted conflicts, but there are also protracted peace processes. The Israeli-Palestinian peace process has never operated in a strategic void. It was born, after all, in the wake of the first Gulf War, and was facilitated by the regional consequences of the end of the Cold War. These days, the process is exposed to two major regional dynamics: the so-called Arab Spring and the Iran nuclear deal. But it is not my suggestion that a shift in the regional conditions is all that is required for an Israeli-Palestinian peace. The formidable built-in flaws in the two-state concept, as well as the lessons of the peace process so far, would have to be addressed if this protracted process is to produce eventually a solution of sorts. The Middle East is a region in flux, a perpetual interim phase in both its domestic and strategic conditions. Therefore, it would be wise to assume that there is more than one scenario where the region can evolve from here. The Arab revolutions and the uncertain Iran deal open opportunities as much as they reaffirm the so far unsurmountable obstacles on the way to allowing the Middle East to abandon its condition as probably the most dysfunctional part of the world. In the eyes of Israel and America's Arab allies these days, the US is perceived as an exhausted power that is retreating from its commitments in the Middle East. It is leaving behind an Iraq in a state of implosion into rivers of blood, with Al-Qaeda, that was never there when Iraq was occupied, becoming a truly formidable challenge, and an Afghanistan practically in the hands of the Taliban. US credibility suffered a major setback, particularly with its vacillations on the Syrian front, where it practically offered immunity to Bashar al-Assad to continue slaughtering his people. As to Iran, this is seen by all as the last and ultimate betrayal, for it leaves America's, these are not my opinion, this is the perception of the others, for it leaves America's allies in the region at the mercy of Iran's rising power, a power that has now acquired international legitimacy as a threshold nuclear state. The Iran deal has turned into one of the most serious crises of trust ever in US relations with its Middle East allies. It is particularly acute in the case of the Sunni Arab rulers, the most concerned of which are the Gulf states led by Saudi Arabia, and who had already seen President Obama turning his back on them in the early days of the Arab Spring. Even though they do not have much of an alternative, both Israel and the Arab states would find it difficult to trust future American commitments to their security. The Obama administration and Israel differ radically in their interpretation of the Iran deal. To Netanyahu, this is a historic mistake that legitimizes Iran as a nuclear threshold state, whereas for Obama, this is a breakthrough that opens the possibility of denying military nuclear capabilities to Iran and turning it into a benign regional power that can help solve other regional crises and refrain from undermining the Arab-Israeli peace process. To Netanyahu, this Iran agreement might turn out to be the prelude to proliferation. Other states in the region might now aspire to reach the same threshold status as Iran. Conspicuously, Israel's supposed nuclear capabilities were never a reason for the Sunni Arab states to become nuclear. Israel's calculated nuclear opacity served them well. They did not have to respond to a non-existent pressure from their constituencies to follow in Israel's footsteps. Moreover, the fact that the Arabs went frequently to war with Israel was tantamount to a message to both the Jewish state and their own constituencies that they are not to be deterred by Israel's supposed nuclear capabilities. Iran's case has proved to be totally different. This says something extremely important about the strategic realities of the Middle East. The divide between Jews and Arabs blinded our eyes from seeing the true complexity of a region that is divided on practically every issue. The Sunni-Shiite rivalry, with Iran being perceived as a threatening, rising empire that needs to be stopped, even at the cost of a tacit alliance with the Jewish state, or if you wish, the small Satan, is as deep as one can imagine. That Iran might be one day in possession of nuclear arms is the second calamity of historic dimensions that, in the eyes of the Sunni Arabs, has been America's gift to the region in the last decade. The first was turning Iraq into an Iranian protectorate and into the first Arab state in history to be ruled by Shiites. This is the perception of the Sunni Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia. Netanyahu does not believe that the final deal would be substantially different than the interim agreement. There is not going to be a rollback of Iran's nuclear potentialities. His working premise, Netanyahu's working premise, that would now condition his regional outlook as well as his approach to the Kerry peace process, to the John Kerry peace process. We need to give each peace process so many peace processes we have. We need to differentiate them by tagging them. And to the Kerry peace process with the Palestinians is that Iran's status as a threshold nuclear state would be maintained in the final agreement. In fact, Israel sees Obama's objective not in cutting short Iran's nuclear program, but in unleashing a process whereby the Islamic Republic changes in a way that would dilute the gravity of its nuclear ambitions. This is not about rolling back her nuclear program, but about bringing Iran to some kind of political transformation. The same kind of transformation that took place in the Soviet Union, for example. The assumption is that, as in the case of China, the introduction of Iran into the global system has the potential of making it into a more benign regional and international player. This is where the two parties differ in the interpretation of what this deal means. But Iran becoming a benign international player a replica or a Middle Eastern replica of China is a long-term scenario that today convinces neither Israelis nor Arabs. They would rather subscribe to John Maynard Keynes' dictum. He said, when brushing aside long-term economic predictions, he asserted that the most solid prediction he could advance was that in the long term, we'll all be dead. In the immediate term, we now see indications that Israel and some Arab states are coming closer to each other in a tacit alliance, attentive to Iran's moves and policies. Such an alliance would have only one important obstacle for it to become an overt alliance, and that is the Palestinian problem. The Arab incumbent regimes would have from now on to steer a cautious line between the pressure of their public opinions against the betrayal of the Palestinian cause and their need to collaborate with Israel in stemming the rise of Iran. What we might probably not see, I guess, is an irresistible all-Arab pressure from Israel's Arab neighbors to go to the extra mile towards President Abbas. Public statements and conventional rhetoric notwithstanding, from WikiLeaks talks, we know that cutting the Iranian snake's head is a priority over Palestine, as far as the Gulf states are concerned, particularly Saudi Arabia. As to Netanyahu's Israel, it now sees itself as a power that has been defeated by Iran on this round. Israel of Netanyahu is perceived, and in many ways it is a genuine and true perception, as a status quo country, and it was defeated by an anti-status quo emerging power, Iran. Israel would lose its supposed nuclear monopoly and could claim to be unable to make the necessary concessions for the creation of a Palestinian state. The latent tensions between Israel and the US would be an underlying factor in the relations in the foreseeable future. To Netanyahu, Obama betrayed Israel when he sacrificed his ally Hosni Mubarak and paved the way for the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, and now when he reached a deal with Iran behind his back. Israel's possible readiness to offer territorial and security concessions to the Palestinians could now be constrained by concerns that US military involvement in guaranteeing militarily an Israeli-Palestinian peace might not be particularly credible. Israel's conventional strategic wisdom was based on an equation of Bushehr versus Yitzhar. Bushehr is a nuclear reactor, a nuclear center in Iran, and Yitzhar is the name of an emblematic settlement. You give us Bushehr, that is, you destroy Bushehr, get rid of Bushehr, and who will get rid of the settlements? That was the conventional strategic equation that operated under the Netanyahu government. That is, the readiness to dismantle settlements in the heartland of Judea and Samaria is there if the Iranian centrifuges in Bushehr were dismantled. In Netanyahu's eyes, this does not seem to be taking place. This exacerbates further his approach to talks with the Palestinians. Israel's attitude to the Palestinian peace process is also affected by the Arab revolutions. Israeli security planners can now cite the anarchy on its borders as a preoccupation that precludes any serious peace initiatives on its part. Netanyahu's mentality and that of his party where a strong Tea Party component has emerged lately, would lead him to keep his powder dry and wait for developments to unfold in the region before making risky moves on the political security front. To create a Palestinian state when existing Arab states seem to be crumbling and a part of Palestine is in the hands of Salafists and Hamas does not look to Netanyahu a particularly brilliant idea right now. Israel today, and for this one does not have to be Netanyahu, one can be on his left, is preoccupied by the fact that he is surrounded by 4 failing states: Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, and Sinai. These are Israel's neighbors. So it conditions in many ways the attitude to the Palestinian issue. Another interesting impact of the Arab turmoil on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process has to do with Jordan. Professor Brenner just told me that Netanyahu is today in Jordan, and I'm not surprised at all. Particularly sensitive to an Israeli-Palestinian peace, Jordan can suffer from a failed peace process. But Jordan has also strong strategic relationship with Israel. One historian once defined Jordan in the past as the best of Israel's enemies. But today it is even better. Not only do we have a peace agreement, but the degree of strategic cooperation between Israel and Jordan is particularly intimate in these days. And because of the fighting in Syria, it is this relationship that appears to have been awarded priority over the Palestinian issue in recent months. The leaks that came from the royal household in Amman regarding meetings between the king and Netanyahu, where military coordination has been agreed upon, including drone reconnaissance flights along the Syria-Jordanian border, are the expression of a military alliance between the two countries that has relegated, in the eyes of the Jordanians, the Palestinian problem right now to a secondary position. The pressure for a two-state solution will always be there, but the degree of intensity will be left for better days. One positive development has to do with the rise of the military in Egypt, always referring to its impact on the Israeli-Palestinian situation. In that sense, it is positive. It can be negative in other senses. The military removed the Brotherhood from power and began energetically closing the Gaza-Sinai border, the smuggling tunnels, and cracking down on Salafists in both Sinai and through pressure on Hamas in Gaza as well. With Hamas weakened, presumably President Abbas can negotiate free of domestic or freer, perhaps not free, but freer, of domestic Islamist pressure. Moreover, under current conditions, any Israeli military response to attacks from Gaza is likely to be dealt with tolerance by the ruling Egyptian military authorities. The relations between Israel and Egypt have never been so close since the peace that was signed between the two parties so many years ago. Now, notwithstanding John Maynard Keynes' reflection on the long term, the real question today boils down to whether leaders are truly capable to see an historic opportunity and depart from their paralyzing ideological fixations into a bold attempt to explore new ways. Netanyahu's predicament has much to do with him being essentially a conservative in revolutionary times. He did not prove to be wrong, admittedly, when he was alarmed and unimpressed with what others saw as the beginning of an era of democracy in the Arab world, and preferred not to budge on any front, the Palestinian track included. But now he is faced with a truly revolutionary situation. This is his strategic nightmare come true. Iran's possible integration into the international community without having to dismantle its nuclear potential. To him, Iran's diplomatic shift is a simple tactical move, not a strategic change of course. Iran's charm offensive, so Netanyahu believes, is just about the elimination of the sanctions that crippled its economy, a tactical retreat in order to regroup and go back at a later stage and recover the path to nuclearization. Netanyahu is adamant in his conviction that this is about tactics more than about strategy. But then, what do we mean by strategy? If just acquiring the status of a nuclear state or a threshold nuclear state is Iran's strategic purpose, Netanyahu is right. But what about the possibility that the diplomatic revolution that is taking place these days in the great game of the Middle East might unleash a careful and possibly long process, but one that might be leading to a meaningful rapprochement between Tehran and Washington, that would be translated down the road into a constructive role by Iran in reining in Hezbollah and Hamas, stopping its drive to derail the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and assisting in the stabilization of Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, something that no Arab ally of the US in the region is capable of doing. The Arab League has been a monumental failure on all these fronts. Why should this be against Israel's interest that America should not leave the region as a defeated power on all these fronts and be able instead to remain as the pivot of a possible regional system of peace and security? Admittedly, this is not a scenario we are seeing now and we might not see in the most immediate future. And the reasons are these. Neither the administration, nor the American administration, nor the Iranians are there yet. The Iran interim deal, assuming it is allowed to evolve into a final settlement by domestic American constraints, now there is a motion in Congress and the Senate that has reached already 60 senators to impose sanctions on Iran. If it reaches 67, it vitiates the presidential veto. So that's a real problem, domestic. So if the interim deal is allowed to become a final deal, it is not going to be the grand bargain that was talked about in 2003. In 2003, the Iranians, behaving in a very rational way, proposed to the Bush administration to put on the table all the issues: the nuclear issue, the Israel-Palestinian problem, Hezbollah, Lebanon, Hamas, and they were ready to negotiate on all this wild array of issues, behaving in a very rational way. The American response came through Vice President Dick Cheney when he said that we do not negotiate with evil. And today, everybody would miss that grand bargain, but we are not there now. This deal with Iran is only and almost exclusively on the nuclear issue. It doesn't affect directly, it doesn't include issues that have to do with regional problems facing America, Israel, and the peace process. So this is not the 2003 grand bargain. For Iran, a strategic intimacy with the US would be a betrayal of the revolution's identity. This is the uppermost concern, the regime, the survival of the regime. What the hell will happen with this regime if after Friday prayers people cannot chant slogans of death to Israel and death to America. That is a major crisis for the revolution. I'm not joking at all. It is in their interest to position themselves as a responsible challenger of American policies in the region, the representative of an alternative idea. In my view, this is the strategic purpose of Iran. They are not aspiring to replace Israel as the region's darling of America. That is not their strategic objective. Their strategic objective is to be a pole, an anti-pole of reference in the region, representing alternative ideas and alternative policies. They are not looking for partnership with the US. For this foreseeable future, Iran will continue to be America's main rival in the region, with an agreement on the nuclear issue, and certainly without it. As to the US, it will aspire to some sort of select cooperation in matters of mutual concern, fighting Al-Qaeda in Iraq, for example. But America would be careful not to alienate further its allies in the region with grand schemes of cooperation with Iran. This is too premature for both parties, both the Iranians and the Israelis. The strategic equation is not changing then overnight. This would require a long process of accommodation. This means that Netanyahu's discourse about the difficulties to make painful concessions in Palestine, so long as the Iran threat is not neutralized, will continue to be an underlying factor of the US-sponsored Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. In fact, the chances of the Kerry process are to be determined within the narrow window that is compounded by two types of leverages. One that the US can use against Netanyahu, and the other that Netanyahu can use against the Obama administration. The US threat has to do with delivering Israel to the ire of the Europeans, the NGOs, and the international community as a whole if it fails to reach a settlement and open the way to this process that always concerned Netanyahu. Sometimes he exaggerated it, but now it might be in the wake of a possible collapse of the peace talks and the responsibility being put on Israel's shoulder, a process of delegitimation and sanctions and UN resolutions, etc. This is the American implicit threat, and in fact, John Kerry said it many times, that the process is his way to stem this tide of anti-Israel policies that can be unleashed in case there is no agreement. But Netanyahu has a counter threat, and this counter threat has to do with his clout in American politics, his clout in Congress. What you see today happening in Congress with the sanctions on Iran. This, I'm afraid, does not allow, this space between these two issues, these two leverages, does not allow for the necessary freedom of maneuver for the Americans to produce the kind of deal that President Abbas can accept. But we are allowed to speculate, however long a shot this might be, which is, I think, not a totally wild speculation. And I do believe that this is the role of leaders, as I said previously, to try and see opportunities, windows of opportunities, seize them, and turn what perhaps started as a tactical move by the Iranians to convert it, to turn it into a strategic change. Israel, in my view, this is my view, does not have to fall back on fatalism and persist in seeing its competition with Iran as a zero-sum game. An American-Iranian deal on the nuclear issue has the potential for paving the way to a more civilized competition even between Israel and the Islamic Republic. It is not superfluous to mention that Iran and Israel had, over the years, decent working relations. And more surprisingly, that was the case even after the coming of Khomeini to power. Israel and Iran conducted business well into the Iraq war. There has been throughout a fundamental affinity between these two countries, if only because, as the two main non-Arab states in that part of the world, they share this paranoia of being surrounded by a hostile Arab environment. One way to explain the dramatic change that took place in the relations between Israel and Iran in the early 1990s, has to do precisely with the launching of the Arab-Israeli peace process. It was then, one can almost give a precise date, when the megaphone warfare between Israel and Iran started. It started in the wake of the Oslo agreements, not before. And I can remind you that Khomeini came to power in the late 70s. It was then that Israelis and Iranians started to talk about a doomsday conflict between them. The US-sponsored Arab-Israeli peace process was a nightmare to the Iranians. They suddenly saw Israel making headway into the Arab world, starting diplomatic relations with Arab countries from Morocco down to the Gulf sheikdoms and even beyond to Indonesia, which Rabin was the first prime minister to ever set foot in. The Oslo peace framework turned out to be for Israel the gate to the Arab world. The dreams about the transformation of the Middle East, with Israel as an integral component of a regional community of nations, seemed suddenly a tangible reality. There was a point when Mr. Peres, Shimon Peres, even suggested that Israel join the Arab League. Yeah, he said that. There is always a demarcation line. We need to have a demarcation line between vision and fantasy. Although there was much wishful thinking, especially by the Israelis, in all of this, the fear of the Iranians that Israel might come closer to its Arab enemies became a watershed, where the Iranians started to see that an Israeli-Arab peace would condemn them and their revolution to being isolated in a hostile world that lives in peace with Israel. It was the peace process that became the enemy of the Iranians more than Israel as such. More an enemy of an Israeli-Arab reconciliation than of Israel as such, the resort of the mullah's regime to an incendiary anti-Jewish, pan-Islamic discourse was its way to extract Iran from its isolation and present its regional ambitions in a light palatable to the Sunni majorities. For in an Arab Middle East, Iran is the natural enemy. In an Islamic Middle East, Iran is the potential leader. An anti-status quo power, Iran was not pursuing nuclear capabilities in order to destroy Israel, but as a quest for prestige and influence in a hostile environment and as a shield to its challenge to the regional order. An Iran that develops working relations with the US cannot by definition continue to be a mortal enemy of Israel. That the US and Iran might develop common interests in the Middle East is not necessarily bad news for Israel. History suggests that no country should have an eternal enemy. And Israel would be well advised not to rule out a priori the opportunities that are emerging in the wake of this Iran deal. It is America's difficult task, however, to avoid falling into a situation whereby it strengthens Iran at the expense of its traditional allies in the region. It would have to find a way to square the circle and not allow Iran to get away with its support for its own rogue organizations, such as Hezbollah, while it supposedly collaborates with the US in combating common enemies such as Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Assuming that Arabs and Israelis persist in their doomsday interpretation of the Iran deal, this does not have to be necessarily bad news for the Israeli-Palestinian process. The changing regional conditions, as I said, leads to an Arab quest for security coordination with Israel. And for the first time, Israel now can see around the corner the possibility that an agreement on Palestine will open the door to an open alliance, to an overt alliance with the Arab world. This suggests another reason for Israel, backed by Iran's Arab enemies, not to postpone peacemaking with the Palestinians. Interestingly, then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin made a similar observation about Iran some 20 years ago in explaining the rationale for the Oslo process. The problem, however, is that the Netanyahu school is radically different than Rabin's. Not only does it believe that Jewish ancestral rights in Judea and Samaria call for a continuous presence of Israel in parts of the land, it also assumes that any meaningful territorial concessions to the Palestinians needs to be preceded by the neutralization of all and every existential threat emanating from the outer circle of the region, namely Iran and Iraq. In fact, President George W. Bush was the president that best concurred with this Israeli right-wing philosophy. His war in Iraq and policies towards Iran were exactly in line with this approach. Interestingly, both he and his father moved to promote an Israeli-Palestinian peace only after their respective Iraq wars. That was exactly what the Netanyahus and the Sharons wanted and understood. We can make painful concessions on Palestine if we solve the problem, the existential threats emanating from the outer circle of the Middle East. What Netanyahu should not rule out a priori, however, is that the Iran deal might have in it the potential of neutralizing for Israel precisely the kind of existential threats that his strategic school always saw as an impediment to move forward on Palestine. And I hope it doesn't. Now, these are the effects of the constraints and the pros and cons with regard to the Palestinian problem that the shifting sands of the Middle East can produce, or in my view can produce. But there are, of course, difficulties in the peace process that do not depend only on the regional conditions. After all, we all failed to reach a settlement under different conditions, under all possible conditions. So the changes in the region can help, can be instrumental, can be an obstacle, or an instrument, or a way to, but at the end of the day, decisions need to be taken on the core issues. And one needs to ask the question, if this deal between Israelis and Palestinians is so important to the two parties, and according to all and every opinion poll that we have, the two nations, the two peoples, want a solution even along the 1967 lines. And when it comes to Jerusalem, most Israelis would agree that a Palestinian capital should have its place in Jerusalem as well. So why don't we have an agreement? Maybe because the problem is so intricate, it's so difficult, that is close to being unsolvable, and because it is a solution that is vitally important, but at the same time, incredibly non-attractive. It is non-attractive to the parties. To the Palestinians, this means that will be a gap between the dream or between what they consider to be a tragedy of cosmic dimensions and the poverty of the political solution, of the territorial solution. This will be a state, small state, split between Gaza and the West Bank, sandwiched between two rivals that do not suffer from an excess of love towards Palestinian statehood, Israel on one side and Jordan on the other. And as to Israel, it is not particularly attractive. It is necessary. It is vitally necessary, but it's not particularly attractive. It means getting back to the 1960 borders that not a particular hawk such as Abba Eban defined as Auschwitz borders. It means facing hundreds of thousands of settlers, many of whom are ideological centers. I'm not concerned with the real estate settlers. A poll conducted with 100,000 settlers in the middle, in what Rabin used to call political settlements, found that 30% were ready to get evacuated with compensation, but 70,000 will not. And the non-attractiveness of the solution lies also in that it would lead to a confrontation between security forces, the army, the settlers, and we know that today the sociological structure of the Israeli officer corps is changing, and more are religious officers coming from the settlements, etc. You might see military disobedience. It's not attractive, simply not attractive. And if you add to it the fact that for the Palestinians there is a great difficulty in understanding why they come very close to an agreement. If I can sit with you here and give you details and anecdotes about why we failed in Taba to reach an agreement at the last-ditch attempt to save the process, you will think that it is ridiculous. Nothing remained. But this is exactly what Freud meant when he spoke about the narcissism of minor differences. That is, when we get to the minor differences, we become narcissist about them, particularly narcissist. And sometimes I think that the pre-state situation, is a much more heroic condition than the banality of running a state. Look, I don't know in history of a national movement. And when I say history, I mean modern history, because nationalism is a question of the last 200 years. I don't know of a case in history of a national movement that had the degree of support the Palestinian cause has. Almost to no effect in terms of the practical solution. But it is probably the most popular national movement around. And so maybe there is a fear of crossing the line into statehood that makes it so difficult. Don't forget also that a Palestinian state, if it is created as a result of negotiations, would inevitably require taking very tough decisions by the Palestinians and sacrificing some of the major values, ethos of Palestinian nationalism, the refugees. I mean, everybody understands that they will have to betray the refugees. There's not going to be a massive and perhaps not even a non-massive return. So the Palestinian state is going to be, by definition, illegitimate in the eyes of the Palestinian people. It will suffer from a deficit of legitimacy. I changed my opinion from the days that I was personally involved in the process. Then I thought that we should aspire to have an agreement that says end of conflict and finality of claims. Today, I think that these are values that have been elevated unnecessarily into mythological heights, because there is not going to be end of conflict, even if Abbas signs it. Would these impress the hundreds of thousands of refugees that will not come back? Will this impress Hamas? There is not going to be end of conflict. There will be end of conflict officially, formally. And to me, this is enough. But I do not believe that this would be the end of Palestinian opposition to a state that would be seen as illegitimate, because it does not respond to the fundamental requirements of Palestinian nationalism. And it doesn't solve the problems inherited from the Nakba, from the disaster of 1948. But a peace between Israel and Palestine is important, as far as Israel is concerned, if it reaches internationally recognized boundaries, have a border. This will bring us to peace with the international community, which in my view is no less important than whether or not we are going to have a signature by Abbas that this is the end of the conflict, which it cannot impose on. You will have groups in Lebanon and you have groups there and here that will continue the war. But the importance is to have, this is my opinion today, to have an agreement about recognized boundaries. A couple of reflections on the situation of these negotiations. You might have seen, and I will end with it, you might have seen that recently that the security issues that seemingly the US mediator seems to be siding with Israel on this issue of military control of the Jordan Valley for security reasons, and the question of the Jewishness of the State of Israel, that the Palestinians would have to accept the Jewishness of the State of Israel. It seems to me that these are two issues that the Palestinians would not, I don't believe he can sign them. The impression that I get from the Palestinian side is that they see that the American mediator, the American broker, is closer to the Israeli positions, and I frankly don't see that on the issue of security and the Jewishness of the State of Israel. We will see that the Palestinians can accept that. But I also don't understand, frankly, why the Secretary of State is insisting on a framework agreement. What he is now negotiating is a framework agreement. It's not the peace agreement yet. It's a set of principles. Inevitably, if you go for a framework agreement, you are going to put into it sentences, a language that is ambiguous, because otherwise the parties will not sign it. And we have had enough of it. I mean, Oslo was an ambiguous document. And when we went to Camp David, we ran into a minefield, because it's whatever you touched had 2 or 3 interpretations. So this is a repetition, and this is an administration that has been there for 20 years on this issue. And that I thought that it might have learned a lesson. My second comment on the negotiations is that I do believe that, or rather, I don't believe that that it is possible to reach an agreement on the current way of doing things. Yes, everybody knows more or less where the solution lies, but American mediation as such has a problem. The Americans understand, the Palestinians understand how important is the US because it has a given leverage on Israel, but this is not sufficient. You will need to have an envelope of other nations that would have to participate in this to allow the Palestinians to make the necessary concessions. I think that we might see down the road at some point that what we saw with Iran now, the P5+1, is not at all a bad model. Maybe even at some point an American plan will be put on the table, not a framework agreement, a final plan will be put on the table. A plan is okay. The problem is the US ready to work for its implementation, which means investing political capital, which means putting together a delicate international diplomatic architecture that would allow the international community to coax the parties into accepting the plan. That is a very complex thing. And maybe at some point, even bringing the American peace plan into the Security Council to make it into a UN Security Council resolution as to what is the internationally accepted interpretation of 242. And we need to think about different ways. And if all fails, the current paradigm of direct negotiations, the international paradigm which I've been supporting for years now, if all fails, and Israel is faced with the specter of a one-state solution and is cornered by the international community into a voyage of isolation towards isolation and sanctions, etc., Israel might then, as a last resort, use the paradigm of unilateral withdrawal. Let us not forget that a prime minister in Israel was elected on that ticket, the convergence plan of Ehud Olmert. He was elected on such a ticket that is doing in the West Bank what Sharon had done in Gaza. The unilateral withdrawal has a long pedigree in Israel's history. It's not something very marginal. In fact, already in 1968, Yitzhak Ben Aaron, who was a mythological labor leader, left-wing, spoke about unilateral withdrawal. Sharon did it. Barak has supported it. Olmert tried it. So that's not something that is totally outlandish in the Israeli political map. When faced with a doomsday scenario of demographic decline, Israel might opt for such a solution. Zionism is more about demography than about land. If you look at the different phases of leading to statehood, 1937, with the Peel Commission, we accepted the proposals of the Peel Commission. 1947, we accepted that. 1948, during the war, Ben-Gurion opposed going into the West Bank because of demographic reasons. That was 1948. Even today, Avigdor Lieberman's proposal about swapping lands on an ethnic basis vindicates the thesis that I'm trying to advance here, that Zionism even according to Lieberman, is not about land, or is more about demography than about land. In fact, Avigdor Lieberman, what he's saying is an implicit recognition of the 1967 borders. Nobody today, by the way, remembers how did we get to having control on the Ara Valley, on Wadi Ara, which is what he wants now to swap. In fact, we got it during the Rhodos negotiations, the Rhodos negotiations, after an ultimatum by Ben Gurion on King Abdullah of Jordan, that is the great-grandfather of the current king, that he wanted that part of that was not natural, that it did not come naturally. He wanted it for strategic reasons. Anyway, so the fundamental requirement here is ethnic, national, not territorial. So whenever faced with the dilemma, Zionism has always opted for demography, and if worst comes to worst, I guess that this would be the scenario that that would prevail if there is no solution through the Kerry paradigm, through the international paradigm. We might find ourselves with a unilateral disengagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for, I think it needs a combination, which is quite rare, by the way, of politician and scholar, to give such an in-depth analysis of the current situation, but also the whole historical background. And I'm glad Professor Ben-Ami is ready to answer some questions. So please keep in mind it is Q&A, not A&A, so you should ask the questions. He's giving the answers and try to make them precise and short.
And do we have any students?
We have a mic here and we have another one here.
We give preference here to student questions if we have students first and faculty.
Well, I hope
And
here's a student.
Duran.
So you gave a lot of reasons of why.
Maybe just introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Aaron. I'm a freshman in SIS. You talked about how the negotiations right now maybe wouldn't be in the best interest of the two parties due to what's happening. But could you explain maybe like what makes this negotiations and the times now different than the many other times that we've had negotiations?
Well, I think that they are different only in the sense of what is the interpretation of leaders as to the meaning of this moment. If leaders are ready to see that this is a window of opportunity, or as other leaders would say, this is a moment of total chaos in the region where the strategic realities are changing by the day, and we better not take risky decisions before we see the sands settling down. So the question is the leader. When we went, for example, to negotiate in Camp David, there was no obvious reason to make this leap into the final settlement. There was no obvious reason, but the Prime Minister used to speak always about the Titanic that doesn't yet see the iceberg, but he could see the iceberg. He said, I can see that, but it is now we don't see it. Not everybody sees it. That's a question essentially of leadership, because every moment is a good moment, and the bad moment, it depends on the ripeness in the mind of the decision makers, if they are ready to seize the moment and lead it. Yes. So in that sense, today, the perception in the region, frankly, is that the process responds to an American drive more than the wish of the parties. In Oslo, for example, it was the parties that produced it without America. So now, by the way, the other day, the Minister of Defense, yesterday or the day before yesterday, the Israeli Minister of Defense came out with a tirade against Kerry, saying that this missionary zeal is not understood. So it's an American process. I mean, the parties don't see it that way. Depends on the leadership and on their capacity to interpret reality.
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm a freshman and I'm an SAS major. And I was wondering, just to get some background, you said that that a lot of Israelis are for peace now. That I'm wondering, why did they elect someone that seems to have a hard time accepting peace?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The reason is very simple. The question of peace or war has hardly ever been the question put to Israelis in elections. Israel is a kaleidoscopic society where you have, in many ways, it reminds me of American politics. In one particular way, elections in Israel and in America look to me very frequently as cultural wars more than political debates. In your country, it is about abortion and about religion, about the family, etc., etc. It doesn't seem to be the policy towards China or the foreign, not even Israel, you know. I don't believe, for example, the Jews in America vote only because of Israel. They are a liberal community that has different opinions on different issues. So in Israel, the elections are around religion, secularism, ethnic groups, social issues, etc., etc. And then you form the coalitions that you form. But that is the reason. How could you explain otherwise that in the middle of the second intifada, suddenly a new party emerges? Pensioners, you know. Is this exactly what the response to the intifada? Well, these are Israeli politics.
We're quite successful.
Hi, I'm Joyce Winslow. I wrote a book with Dr. Harold Brown, who was the Secretary of Defense under Carter and was responsible for the military negotiations at Camp David. At that negotiation, we wrote a chapter. The personalities of Sadat and Carter were critical to those negotiations. Could you give us a sense of the personalities of the people negotiating in Geneva?
In Geneva,
Yeah.
now. Well, you see, let me just, as a brief introduction, one critique that was leveled at Ehud Barak in Camp David, I know you didn't mention Barak, but was that he did not know how to develop trust with Arafat. There was no chemistry, and indeed it is extremely difficult to find two people more different than these two guys. But at Camp David 1, the Camp David you mentioned, right? The Camp David with Egypt, there was no trust between Begin and Sadat. Sadat and Begin did not meet even once during the first 10 days of the conference. There was a mistrust between the parties. Sadat didn't like this Polish legalistic mind of Begin. Begin was, I think it was Ezer Weizmann who once told me a story about a meeting between Begin and Sadat in Ismailia. There was a summit in Ismailia, and the room, there was a heat of, I think, 45 degrees Celsius, and everybody was sweating, and the room was closed, and the Begin was preaching about all kinds of legalistic issues. And he mentioned a scholar by the name of Oppenheimer. Begin said, Oppenheimer said, and then Sadat exploded at some point and said, Oppenheimer, Mahmoud, open the window. He said, he said to the guy that says about. So these were the personalities, you know. He was fed up with the guy preaching all kind of legalistic issues, etc. So I think that personalities, of course, are important, but you know, the goal is to say a leader needs to have a surprise under his sleeves. You need, I mean, at the end of the day, trust is important, but I think that we sometimes give it too much importance. You know, how much did we invest, Israel-Palestine, in bringing closer Israelis to Palestinians so that they can trust each other? But in the day of truth, when there is a proposal on the table and it is not accepted, we decline into war. So the question is if leaders are capable, even if they don't trust. Normally, leaders are not very sympathetic people. De Gaulle was not a very nice person. Nixon was not probably a very nice person. But they took decisions with the enemy. They changed the course of history when they did not trust the enemy. What trust did de Gaulle have with Boumediene and the FLN in Algeria? No trust whatsoever. But he took a decision. I personally don't believe that trust is the issue. The issue is leadership, vision, and the capacity to take decisions. And understand that an agreement is not a zero-sum game. Because if you are fully satisfied with an agreement, this means that the other side is fully unsatisfied. And this cannot be, and you can't produce an agreement on that line. You need to find, that is, wisdom, common sense is more important than trust. Now in Geneva, what you saw is an Iranian team that, to me, it is, I envy, in fact, frankly, the capacity of the Iranians to produce such a dramatic change in the wake of elections and come with such a charm offensive that has a substance in it, where they could preserve what they define as their right for enrichment, start bringing an end to the sanctions regime, and open a path for recognizing the importance or the strategic importance of Iran in the region. I mean, I don't know if they are nice or they are not nice. What I can see is they are intelligent and they had a capacity to negotiate. So that was matter at the end of the day.
My name is Sarah Levin. I'm a senior in SIS. You kind of started to answer my question. My question was, you already talked about the divergent views between Obama and Netanyahu about Iran's true motivations. I was going to ask your personal opinion about Iran's true motivations and whether it would be a historic mistake or whether it's worth it to engage Iran.
I think that much of Netanyahu's critique is right when you come to the details of the Iran interim deal. Let us stress that it is an interim deal so far. First, they have today about 18,000 centrifuges, a couple of thousands of the new generation that can skip the 5% stage and go straight to higher percentages, which is where the bomb can be produced. The plutonium center is not being dismantled. The plutonium center cannot serve for research purposes. It's only, it's a different way to leading to the bomb and to weaponization. So why not dismantle it? The American answer would be, yes, but this is only an interim agreement. We'll see when we negotiate the final agreement. I think that Netanyahu is right in his criticism of the interim agreement if it becomes the model of the final one. And he insists that this is what will happen, because the Iranians would not agree rolling back the project. One of the answers of the Americans would be, listen, you cannot roll back knowledge, because they have the knowledge to do it. And this is it. I mean, they are a threshold nuclear state, so long as they do not become a nuclear state. I think that at the end of the day, if there is a final settlement that rolls back part of the capacities, this might bring Iran further away from the capacity to produce a bomb, but it would not eliminate the possibility of producing a bomb. And Israel would have to come to terms with an Iran that has the capacity, not only Israel, the Saudis and others, that has the capacity, but does not cross the threshold. And we need to recognize that Iran is a regional power to be reckoned with. I mean, it's interesting. If you look at the Middle East, and I don't want to push this too far, but the three most stable and qualitatively meaningful countries in terms of their scientific, economic capacities are three non-Arab states: Turkey, Iran, and Israel. This is the only place in the Middle East where you can see that there is stability, there is economic potentiality that can be translated into a reality. So, and not in vain, such an alliance, Israel, Turkey, Iran, existed in the 1950s and 1960s. There was, at the time it was called the Alliance of the Peripheries. That is, the minorities in the region. That was the making of David Ben-Gurion in the 1950s. So I think that this is where my hope lies, that essentially there is no reason for dispute between Israel. What the hell do we have against the Iranians? Why they have anything to do against us? I mean, there is nothing. Do we have a common border? Jerusalem, are they more popist than the Pope? I mean, it's a question for the Palestinians, for the Arab world. So I think that it is a competition more for strategic supremacy, in a way, more than animosity or hostility between these two parties. So we need to interpret the drive of Iran to have nuclear potential, even if it is not translated into a bomb, as something which is natural for a country of that stature.
Hi, I'm Boaz Atzili. I'm a professor here at SIS. So, as you mentioned, Israel sees a lot of risk and doesn't see much to gain from a current agreement with the Palestinians. I wonder if you can comment on especially why the United States did not take, in light of this fact, the route of, instead of pushing yet again to direct negotiation between Israel and Palestinians, the same way that they did many times before, why did the Obama administration, and Kerry in particular, did not try harder to go through the regional framework, perhaps through the Arab initiative or Saudi initiative, which could have the potential of promising Israel a real acceptance, legitimacy in the region, in addition to the direct peace with the Palestinians, if it would succeed.
Well, I tend to agree with you that the Arab Peace Initiative has been neglected for too long, and it is still there. Even when you touch upon the issue of security, the Palestinian state might be too fragile an entity to carry on its shoulder the burden of Israel's security. Israel's security is a regional issue where you need to involve other Arab states. It affects Jordan. It has to do with the Saudis. It has to do with the Egyptians. So why not have an envelope that is regional? I do believe that when what Professor Brenner defined in such a generous way as my academic tendency to explain and analyze didn't leave me much time to develop this point. But I do agree that you need to have the Arab states as part of the equation. It's not only between us and Palestine. Besides, some of the concessions they need to make can be seen as more legitimate if they are seen as an all-Arab consensus.
Okay. My name is Herbert Grossman. I'm a retired judge. After all these years of telling us that if you give land, Israel's going to get peace, now you tell us that Israel should get land without even getting peace. And you say the reason for that, at least one of the reasons, is a demographic reason. But who in the Israeli government or anyone in power is saying that we ought to take back Area A and Area B in the West Bank or Gaza? No one's suggesting we take that back. So there isn't a demographic problem. What we're discussing now is the rest of the West Bank, which is either vacant or has a vast majority of Jews in it. And you're saying that we ought to give that back, even though we're not, or Israel should, even though it's not going to get peace. And assertively, they're not going to have the same result that they had under Barak when they left South Lebanon, when they withdrew from Area A and Area B, the Intifada, or when they withdrew from Gaza, 8 years of rocket attack.
I think it's the question.
Okay, now,
Not another
how do
lecture.
you address the problem of Israel's security when you give back land that's a mountain range overlooking Netanya and Tel Aviv to people who are not even claiming to make peace with Israel?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I didn't say that to give back land with no peace. The only thing I said is I do not have to insist on the end of conflict. End of conflict is a slogan. Peace means that there is not going to be war. There should not be war, and there should be commitments by both parties and guarantees and arrangements on the ground that there should be no war between the parties. What I meant is that given the complexity of the Palestinian issue and the concessions that the Palestinians are required to make, once they have their state, there would be sections, segments, sectors in Palestinian society, in Palestine and in the Palestinian diaspora, that would not accept this deal. And therefore, Israel must be ready to see that there would be opposition, some of it even violent and armed, from different splinter groups that will emerge in Lebanon, in Jordan, and what have you. Because they claim, at least this is what they claim, they have 6-7 million refugees. These people are not going to come back. And of course, Israel doesn't accept the numbers because these people, they put second and third and fourth generation into the census. But in any case, what I was trying to say is that we are facing a conflict that has no parallel today anywhere in the world in terms of its complexity, this question of millions of refugees, etc. And the Palestinians that will get this slice of land of no more than 5,000 square kilometers. This is Palestine, 5,000. It's, I think it's DC must be more or less that. No, that's the state of Palestine. So what I'm saying is that this state would not satisfy many groups in Palestine. Now, am I going to continue being an occupying power in Palestine? Am I going to continue being at odds with the international community just because there would be all kinds of groups, and by the way, there would be also in Israel, that would not accept the deal and might even challenge it in a violent way from different sectors? Listen, the difference between the two of us seems to be that I am no idealist. I do not believe in universal peace, never believed. I was never a peacenik. I dedicated much of my political career to trying and make peace, but I am fully aware of the fallacies and the flaws in the human character and the character of nations. And therefore, I do not believe in eternal and celestial peace. This we will have when, according to Keynes, when we'll all be dead. But I do believe in workable arrangements. I do believe in peace, perhaps for one generation, for two generations, and then the next generation will try to change, to revise, etc. This is history. We see it. We see it. Now, does it mean that we might not reach down the road, in the fullness of time, something similar to the European Union? Maybe. But look how wrong was Shimon Peres when he spoke about the new Middle East in 1994, that we will have a European community in the Middle East. What European? We don't have even states in the Middle East. Well, how do you want to have a European community? So this is the region we live in. We are surrounded by the Saddam Husseins of the world, by the Nasrallahs of the world, by the Bin Ladens of the world, and we need to try and reduce the risks. And one way to reduce it is not more security, because there is never full security. This is one thing that the US and Israel have in common. We aspire to something that is not reachable, total and absolute security. This question of total and absolute security brought you to Iraq and to Afghanistan and brought us to endless situations that have no solution. We need to be more relativist and understand that, okay, there's not going to be 100% security. No nation has 100% security.
One more question, and unfortunately we have to leave the room. Yes.
Hi, I am a graduate student at SIS, and I was wondering if you can talk about, from a historian point of view and also from your own experience, about the immigration of the Jewish community from many countries, particularly Morocco, where the community has really deep roots.
Well, thank you for the question. She's my Landsman, so it's my Landsman is for men, or but it's Landslady. Landsfrau. Okay. Well, you see, the Zionism historically was the result of Jewish catastrophe. It was born that way. If Theodor Herzl would not have gone to Paris to cover the Dreyfus affair and see how hollow was the emancipation, we might not have had a Jewish state. So the Jews from Arab countries, you assume, and this is implicit in your question, did not experience the same kind of rejection that they did in Europe, and that got into the ultimate tragedy in the Holocaust. There was not that kind of anti-Semitism, but what normally one of the reasons that it didn't happen in the Arab world, in the Arab world, in my view, is that you did not have all these changes that happened in Europe with the Reformation and the French Revolution, etc. I mean, they were essentially traditional societies that remained almost immobile in their attitude to religion and family values, and there was even a syncretic sort of religion and common ground between Muslims and Arabs. Jews decided to leave the Arab countries, Morocco in particular, in the wake of the collapse of French colonialism. That is, the colonial power was the buffer, in a way, between Arabs and Jews. Notwithstanding the fact that I do agree with your implicit assumption that they lived okay, and there was you didn't have the European situation, but nonetheless, when nationalism appears, it is where everything exploded. Arab nationalism was exclusivist. It only wanted in it those who were from, accepted the values of Arab nationalism. The Jews were not there. The Jews were elsewhere. And when the buffer, the colonial buffer disappeared, they felt unprotected. And they felt exposed to attacks, to pogroms that happened, that took place in different parts of the Arab world. And therefore they left. They left, many of them, by the way, not to Israel, many of them to France, Canada, to different countries, but also to Israel.
Well, thank you. You were building the bridge to my